Okay, so we're diving into some heavy stuff today, grief mourning,
Yeah.
and some unconventional perspectives on death. And get this, all this wisdom is coming from one single PDF called Death part13.pdf.
It's fascinating, really not like a collection of different opinions or anything. It's like one focused, deep exploration of the spiritual side of dealing with loss. You could almost call it like a guidebook, I guess, for navigating those parts of loss we don't always think about.
Exactly. So we're going to unpack this unique take on grief, see what practical tools it offers for handling loss, and maybe even challenge some of the assumptions we have about death and remembering those we've lost.
Yeah, sounds good. And speaking of challenging assumptions, the document kind of jumps right in with a bold statement.
Yeah.
It argues that grief doesn't actually come from death itself.
Whoa, that's a curveball right out of the gate. What does it say grief is about then?
The core idea is that grief is more about the feeling of incompleteness that death creates.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. It's not just about missing the person. It's about the hole they leave behind.
Right, precisely.
Yeah.
And it even goes as far as to say that for many people, the pain of losing material security, money, possessions, that can actually feel worse than losing a loved one.
Really?
Yeah, think about a time when you experienced a significant loss. Was it just the absence of that person or thing that caused you pain? Or was it the disruption to your plans, your sense of identity, the future you had envisioned?
That's a tough comparison, but it makes you think, we build so much of our lives around external things, including our relationships. When those are suddenly gone, it's like our whole world shifts.
Exactly. It's that disruption to our wholeness, the sudden absence of something we depended on that fuels the feeling of grief. It's not just the person. It's the future we imagined with them, the role they played in our life. All of that is gone too.
Okay, so I get that grief comes from this feeling of incompleteness.
Yeah.
But how do we move past it? Dwelling on that void doesn't seem very healthy.
Well, the document has a really interesting take on this. It talks about how relationships in their physical form are ultimately temporary. The physical connection ends with death, and what we're left with are the memories.
So instead of focusing on the loss, we should be focusing on the good times.
Right.
Cherish the beautiful moments, as they say.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And taking it a step further, the document suggests finding fulfillment and helping others. Like taking that love and care and directing it outward towards those in need can be a powerful way to fill that void and create something positive.
That makes a lot of sense. Turning grief into action, into something that helps others. It's like honoring the person you've lost by making the world a little bit better.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And speaking of tools for processing grief, there's this one practice mentioned in the document that I found particularly intriguing, Kalabharava karma.
Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. What is Kalabharava karma and how does it tie into grief?
Well, it's not specifically designed for grief, but it can have an indirect effect. Imagine your grandmother's favorite perfume. Even after she's gone, the scent might linger on her clothes, reminding you of her presence. Residual energy is a bit like that lingering scent, except it's a deeper energetic imprint left on objects, particularly those closely connected to the body.
Oh, I see. So Kalabharava karma helps by reducing this residual energy, especially the energetic connections we have to someone who has passed. This doesn't directly tackle the emotional aspect of grief, but by lessening the energetic tie, it could make the emotional impact a bit less intense.
Right. You could think of it that way. Yeah, it's like creating a bit of space between you and the energy of the person you've lost. But the document emphasizes that it's not a magic bullet. You have to be an active participant in your own healing. Rituals and practices can be supportive, but ultimately it's about cultivating the inner strength to move through grief.
So it's like having the right tools for a job, but you still have to put in the work.
Absolutely. It's about developing that awareness, resilience, and understanding to navigate these complex emotions. Speaking of which, the document mentions a rather interesting story about a woman who started feeling her deceased grandmother's disapproval after wearing her clothes and jewelry. She even picked up some of her grandmother's habits.
Wait, so grandma's energy was still hanging out in her stuff, and this woman accidentally tapped into it.
That's what the document seems to suggest. Yeah, it ties back into that concept of residual energy. And it's interesting to note that many cultures have traditions of burning or carefully handling the belongings of the deceased, which could stem from an understanding of this energy.
Makes you think twice about borrowing clothes from grandma's closet.
Yeah,
But seriously, it underlines the need for respect and boundaries even with those who have passed.
exactly. The document cautions against dabbling with the energies of the deceased unless you have a certain level of mastery, because there can be unintended consequences.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground already. Grief is a feeling of incompleteness. the importance of focusing on positive memories, the potential of Kalabhairava karma, and this fascinating concept of residual energy. What's next on our journey through Death part13.pdf? So we just explored some pretty deep stuff about energy and its connection to grief. But now I'm curious about something a bit more tangible, memorials. Those places or things we create to remember those who have passed. I'm thinking grand monuments, small personal tributes, everything in between. What does this document have to say about memorials?
It starts off with a humorous anecdote, actually.
Yeah.
A young boy visits a cemetery for the first time, and after reading all the glowing epitaphs on the tombstones, he asks his mom, "Mom, where do they bury all the horrible people?"
That's a classic. It really points out how we tend to idealize the dead, especially when creating memorials.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, are memorials truly about honoring the deceased? Or are they more about our own needs and emotions, our desire to remember them in a certain way, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a good question. It makes you wonder what the real purpose of a memorial is.
Well, the document makes a distinction between memorials and samadhis, which are specifically designed to make a certain energy accessible to others.
So a samadhi is more than just a place of remembrance. Is it something like those places believed to have a special energy, like a saint's tomb or a sacred grove in nature?
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. The document mentions Viji's samadhi at the Isha Yoga Center as an example. It's said to have a very distinct aura and energy that can even induce a feeling of being bodiless for those who sit there.
Interesting. But what about something like the Taj Mahal? It's this stunning work of art, a testament to love and loss. But is it considered a samadhi?
The document argues that while the Taj Mahal is a beautiful creation, it's not necessarily a space designed to transmit the deceased's energy. It's more of a grand gesture of remembrance, a monument to the living's grief and devotion.
So it's a powerful symbol, but not necessarily a conduit of spiritual energy in the way a samadhi is. And what about pyramids? They're built to house the dead for eternity. You'd think they'd be packed with energy.
The document suggests that pyramids are incredible feats of engineering, powerful tools for physical preservation thanks to their geometric design. However, it emphasizes that this isn't a spiritual process benefiting the dead. It contrasts this with the Indian tradition of cremation, where the focus is on releasing the soul from its physical form.
So while pyramids are about defying death and preserving the physical body, the Indian tradition is more about accepting death and supporting the soul's journey. Two very different approaches. But back to this concept of residual energy, does the document talk about how it relates to mourning practices?
Yes, it dives into the Indian custom of avoiding temples during the mourning period.
I've heard about this tradition, but never really understood the reasoning behind it.
Well, it's connected to the ancient Indian Kula system, where families belong to specific clans, each with its own deity known as a Kula Devata. Imagine it like a family god specific to your lineage.
So each family had their own personal deity. That's fascinating. But how does that relate to avoiding temples during mourning?
Because of the strong genetic resemblance within families, the Kula Devata could mistake a living person for the recently deceased.
Hold on, so you're saying that going to the temple while mourning could cause some kind of spiritual mix-up? Like, the deity thinks you're the one who died?
That's the idea, yeah. It could potentially disrupt your system, leading to physical or energetic imbalances.
That's a pretty intense consequence for just visiting a temple. But this whole concept of a Kula Devata is so intriguing. It's like a glimpse into a world where genetic lineage and spiritual practices were completely interwoven. It makes you wonder if there are any parallels in modern life. Like, do modern families have similar traditions or beliefs about mourning and spiritual boundaries?
That's a great question. The source doesn't really address modern practices, but it does raise the broader question of how we navigate the transition between life and death. Are there things we do, even subconsciously, to create space for grief and transformation? It's definitely something to ponder.
We've gone from grief as this feeling of incompleteness to exploring memorials, mourning rituals, and now even the potential for spiritual mix-ups. What an insightful journey this has been. Wow, we've covered some fascinating ground in this deep dive into Death part13.pdf, exploring everything from the nature of grief to the potential for spiritual mix-ups during mourning. It feels like we've journeyed from the very practical aspects of death to something much deeper.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like the conversation is shifting now, moving beyond the specifics of rituals and traditions towards a broader, philosophical perspective.
It's like we've been climbing this mountain of knowledge, and now we're at the summit. taking in this vast landscape of ideas about life, death, and everything in between.
That's a great analogy. And as we approach the end of this document, it does feel like we're being guided towards a more expansive view of life and death.
Wow.
The document reminds us that death is a natural part of life, and our struggle with it often comes from our attachment to the physical world.
Yeah, throughout this whole deep dive, it's presented all these unconventional ideas, challenging a lot of common assumptions about grief and mourning.
Yes, and you can really see that the perspective presented here is rooted in a deep spiritual understanding. It keeps circling back to the idea that the physical realm is temporary and that true peace comes from transcending our limitations.
That's a really powerful message. If we can shift our focus from clinging to the past to embracing the present moment, maybe we can experience death not as a tragic ending, but as a natural transition. Like accepting the changing seasons, knowing that winter's end brings the promise of spring.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that life and death are two sides of the same coin. One can't exist without the other. And the document seems to suggest that the key to navigating this reality is cultivating inner strength and awareness that allows us to move through grief and loss without being consumed by them.
And that awareness comes from spiritual practices, right? From deepening our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe. It's like we're expanding our consciousness beyond the limits of our physical existence, tapping into a source of peace and joy that transcends the cycle of life and death.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it actually brings us back to something we discussed earlier, the idea of finding fulfillment in service to others. By focusing outward, by dedicating ourselves to something larger than ourselves, we can find meaning and purpose even when facing loss.
It's like taking that grief energy and channeling it into something positive, creating ripples of good in the world.
Exactly. And in a way, that's a form of immortality. The actions we take, the love we share, the contributions we make to the world, those things live on long after we're gone. They create a legacy that extends far beyond our physical lifespan.
Wow, we really have come full circle. From understanding the roots of grief to exploring these profound insights about the interconnectedness of life and death, this has been an incredible journey through deathpart13.pdf. We've unpacked so much: the nature of grief tools for processing loss, the impact of residual energy, the purpose of memorials, the significance of mourning periods, and ultimately this invitation to see death not as an end, but as a transition.
We've only scratched the surface, of course. But if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to keep exploring. There's a whole world of knowledge out there waiting to be discovered about death, grief, and the very nature of life itself.
What resonated with you most from this exploration? How can you apply these insights to your own experience of grief and remembrance, or even to simply living a more joyful life? These are questions worth pondering.
Absolutely. And remember, death is a part of life. But how we choose to live, how we love, how we connect, and how we contribute to the world, that's what truly shapes our legacy. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.